Hello, I'm Lisa Pritchard. Welcome to Jefferson College Library. Today's presentation will be filmed by JCTV and will make it available on the library's YouTube channel. Chris Otto is a professor of English at Jefferson College, and since he was a young boy, he has been fascinated with Native Americans. From 2013 to 2015, he participated in a 3-year National Endowment for the Humanities project titled Native Americans in the Midwest. This experience led him to conduct research on the Osage removal from Missouri and Native American legends surrounding the New Madrid earthquake. This talk, The Cherokee Princess Myth in the Trail of Tears State Park, was first presented at the Missouri Folklore Society Conference. As inheritors of a state and nation created by choices of our ancestors, Professor Otto hopes this presentation will result in dialogue and reflection on the memory and legacy of Indian removal in Missouri. Professor Otto?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you for being here on this gray November day. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement statement. Jefferson College wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and to recognize that the college is situated on traditional Native American homelands, including those of the Shawnee, Delaware, and Osage people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. Okay, so I want to just start off with kind of an overview of a theory, and this comes from the work of a scholar named Patrick Wolfe, and he is sort of the father of this concept of settler colonialism. And so you're probably aware of like colonialism, where one country goes to another to take resources, right? But there's settler colonialism, and this is a little bit more insidious. And this is where you have a group of people who come to sort of remove and replace an existing people and their culture. And as you can see here, colonialism, usually you just have a sort of an executive government that's sort of there to get the oil or to get the rubber or to get the sugar or the tobacco. But settler colonialism, you have lots of people who are coming to take land away, to expand into new territory, and to establish a new society on top of one that once existed. And so we're going to look at this, this myth of the Indian princess and the idea of the state park through the lens of settler colonialism. Because what I'm really kind of interested in is how do we remember the past, and what ways are we sort of rewriting the past in a way to kind of make it more palatable or to tell a different story. So one thing that I noticed is, as I thought back on my childhood, there was always a handful of students in every one of my classes that claimed to have a Cherokee ancestor. Some of you are nodding your heads, so either you have heard that story or you have that experience as well. And one thing I noticed about it is I never heard anyone say they had a male Cherokee ancestor in the family. It was always a female. Recent census data shows that there's been an explosion in self-reporting Native American identity. You can see how it's gone up. And so the number 3 up there, the Cherokee, have about 215,000 enrolled members in the various bands. So there's Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. There's a Cherokee Nation in the east, which is right outside the Smoky Mountain National Park. There is a third band. And then there's a proliferation of these state-recognized bands. but they're not federally recognized. And they don't really have to go through the same rigorous procedure in order to become members. So there's almost 1.5 million people have claimed that they have a Cherokee ancestor. So I started to think about why would there be such a huge increase? And so there's a variety of reasons for that. One of the reasons that that I found was that in the early 1900s, the government was compensating the Eastern Cherokee for lands that they took away before they made them move to the West. And that sort of created this market for people to claim that they were Cherokee in order to get their hands on that money. There's also just like a family story, and there's a variety of reasons for why these stories might exist. There could have been some local reasons why it was more beneficial to deny that you were a Cherokee rather than actually, own that identity. Also in the 1840s and the 1850s, there seemed to be this strange thing, especially with Southerners who wanted to identify as like the original Southerners. And they found that they had a common cause with Cherokee because while the Southern plantation owners and Southerners in general were trying to resist federal intrusion into their land, they kind of saw that as a similar story and found this to be kind of a useful way to not only claim some kind of more authentic ownership of the land, but also to kind of to share in this resistance towards the overreach that they thought of as the federal government. Some people claim Cherokee ancestry out of kind of like a psychological thing to kind of empathize, and it becomes kind of a real thing, and this is the story that they tell themselves. And then also some people, spiritual seekers, that in the literature they're referred to as New Agers or Pretendians or Thindians or wannabes. They're there because they envision Cherokee membership within a tribal group as somehow more meaningful and more connected and more in line with what they think their spirituality is. And so there's a lot of people that cross over from that. I have one more thing on here. We don't have to go to it, but if you're interested, there's a series of articles in the Riverfront Times about one of those state bands. They're called the Northern Cherokee. And from all the reporting I've read, they simply did it because all federal building projects, there's 5% of the bids have to go to minority-owned companies. And so these guys said, we're Cherokee, and they started getting government contracts to build things, even though they're not recognized by any of the three major federally recognized bands. And as far as anybody can tell, none of the people have any Cherokee ancestry. So I thought of this as kind of a strange phenomena, and I thought I would look into kind of the history of this concept of Indian princesses. And many of you probably saw the Pocahontas movie when you were a kid, right? And of course, this is a perfect example of a settler colonial imprint on a real Native American person, and they've sort of changed the story. They've made her into this sympathetic character who wants to protect John Smith, and this is all about love, right? The real story, that's an imprint of Pocahontas. Her baptized name was Rebecca, and her last name was Rolfe, but she also has the name of Pocahontas. This is the front page of an operatic theater production that was completed in 1807 known as The Indian Princess, which is based on the Pocahontas story. So the fact that we have these Indian princesses, and we can trace them all the way back to the really early 1800s, and even further than that, if you want to go back to like the 16th century, Europeans have always enjoyed playing Indian, playing with the idea of what an Indian is, and sort of using the concept of an Indian almost as like a canvas to project onto what we want to say about Native Americans. And in particular, the Indian princess tends to be peaceful and fair-minded, and she sort of embodies all of these classical feminist, not feminist, but female, womanly, if you will, characteristics and traits. And so you can also see this like in the Lover's Leap kind of stories. Have you ever been to Creve Coeur Lake, Creve Coeur Park? There's a Lover's Leap there where she was so sad that she couldn't be with this man that she jumped off the side of the cliff and she dies. And Lover's Leaps are everywhere. They're all over the place. And same kind of thing with Indian princesses. This is a character that we've created that really doesn't exist because the Cherokee didn't have a hereditary aristocracy. There's no such thing as a princess. So let's take a look at the Cherokee princess and many of the different variations. So this is such a popular trope, or I wouldn't say it's an archetype, but musicians. This is Pale Moon from 1977. She claimed that she was Cherokee and Ojibwa, but she wasn't enrolled in either. She released an album. This is another princess, Sienna, and she was a singer. And then the British wrestler, the Cherokee princess, it proliferates. And there's another page. If you want to get a Halloween costume, I know it's late, maybe early for next year, you could be a Cherokee princess. This is a postcard of a Cherokee princess. That's a book that says there's no such thing as a Cherokee princess. Your grandmother was not a Cherokee princess, and then here's the Behold, This is a Cherokee Princess shirt. So you could get a whole line of clothing and wear them. I like, this is an album of religious music titled Wait a Little Longer, Please Jesus, and this is by the Cherokee princess. Her name was Ramona. But we don't have to necessarily even go that far back to think about all the different people who claim to have Cherokee ancestry. Elizabeth Warren got in a bunch of trouble for that. Johnny Depp has claimed that he is Cherokee. Bill Clinton told N. Scott Momaday that he was 1/4 Cherokee. I could go on and on. It continues to exist, and many, many people claim this ancestry. And like I said, I think there was at least a handful. I did an informal poll in all my classes and said, raise your hand if you have Cherokee ancestry. And about 1/4 of the students in each class raised their hand. So it's a thing. And Missouri has had a Cherokee princess, and that's what I'll get into here in the next part. So this isn't really a discussion of the Trail of Tears because that's a really complicated issue. There's multiple detachments. I'm not really going to go into great detail to discuss, Cherokee practices and Cherokee culture. I'm just going to say this. This is what they claim is their ancestral homeland, and it's really sort of centered right here. And this is Franklin, North Carolina. This is where the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is. Have you ever been to the Smokies? So right outside the Smokies, there's a town called Cherokee, and they have a Cherokee heritage village and a site and museums. The Cherokee were known as one of the 5 civilized tribes, and they had been creatively resisting as well as accommodating European American interests. So the civilization process was to try to get Indians to be Christian, to be private property owners, to farm, and to adopt kind of patriarchal attitudes towards marriage and work. So the Cherokee were one of the first to develop a syllabary. So they had a written system. They had a newspaper by 1820, the Cherokee Phoenix, which you can still read. And I read an article that I'm going to share with you from that newspaper. And unlike the Seminole and the Creek, who sort of chose to try to fight, the Seminole were actually really successful. they were able to sort of hold on to their land for some time. And actually, many of the Cherokee warriors fought with Andrew Jackson against the Creek when they were trying to move them out of Alabama and Mississippi, that area. So they had also adopted the sort of plantation style agriculture, and there was an elite group of Cherokee people that actually owned slaves, and they were very rich. And so they sort of became most of the leadership. They had a constitution written by 1827. They had an executive functioning government. They had a capital. It's called New Eshota. It's a town in Georgia. So they also, instead of trying to fight like the Seminoles, they took the government to court, and they won 2 Supreme Court cases. One is called Worcester versus Georgia, and the other one is, I can't remember the name of it, but they won both of their cases. Essentially what it came down to was, could the state of Georgia force the Cherokee who were living in that area to move? And the Supreme Court, John Marshall, wrote the majority opinion, and he said, this is a sovereign nation, and so you can't do that. You can't force them to leave. And Andrew Jackson was president at the time, and he said, I'm not going to enforce it. That's fine. You can make the rule, you can say that all that you want to, but there'll be no enforcement on our end. And so by the 1820s and 1830s, the tribe had kind of split up. There was a small group of Cherokee that said, we can see the writing on the wall, we're out of here. And so a group of them went to Arkansas, and they lived between the White River and the Arkansas River, and there were obviously some in southern Missouri as well. And then after the Trail of Tears began, they kind of got divided into 2 groups: the ones that went to Oklahoma, and then kind of the ones that were able to sneak back and go back to their original homeland. So before they were able to start the forced marches, which there were between 16,000 and 17,000 Cherokee people were rounded up from their home, and they were first sent to these forts. You can see all these forts that sort of spiral out of the capital. That's New Echota right there, and then all these little forts. So General Winfield Scott was in charge of this expedition, and he sent soldiers into these people's homes and said, okay, you have to leave right now. And then they held them in these little stockade, these are like prisoner of war camps. Before then, they divided them up into the various detachments and moved on to the west. And so they thought that it was going to take about 80 days, and they allowed for about $66 per person to get from, northern Georgia to Oklahoma. And we're going to see it took a lot longer, and it cost a lot more. In today's dollar figures, the federal government spent about $2 billion moving just the Cherokee. But they also moved the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Kappaha, all those other people. So between the years of about 1820 and 1840, 100,000 people were relocated from east of the Mississippi to the west side of the Mississippi. So just in case you're worried about mass deportations coming in the next political season, we have a legacy, and they've done it before, and it didn't turn out particularly well. So at this point, I want to kind of set the stage of how Missouri sort of plays a role in this. And Missouri is literally crisscrossed. It's the site of people being exiled to the west. It's the site of people being exiled to the east. And this time period, the winter of 1838, so from about November of 1838 to February of 1838, this is what's happening. Across northern Missouri, just outside of Liberty and Kansas City, the governor of the state of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, gave an execution order, extermination order that said Mormons have to leave or they can be killed on sight. So in November, these people are getting round up and they're going to go across the river and they're going to cross here and go into Quincy, Illinois, and eventually make their way up to Nauvoo. At the same time, about 1,000 Potawatomi are being forcibly removed across northern Missouri. They actually pass each other. And the people who are fighting the Mormons see this huge group of armed guys on horseback with guns and bayonets, and there's all these Indians. And they say, hey, would you help us? We're trying to kill these Mormons. And they go, no, we're trying to get these Potawatomi people out of here. So they didn't obviously join up, but I'm sort of just amazed at this, that all these three of these things were happening at roughly the same period of time. And then across southern Missouri, this is the northern route, this is the Hildebrand route, this is the Benji route, and then there's the water route too. But across this portion of the state, between January, February, March, right, you've got the Cherokee. And there's, like I said, between 16 and 17,000 people going across the bottom of the state. So our state history is a colorful one with a lot of interesting events. And this time period is going to be kind of the backdrop for the story of Missouri's Cherokee princess. Okay, so, right, the story is really going to focus on the northern route and the crossing of the river. Here's Anna, Illinois. Here is where Trail of Tears State Park is. And this is Jackson. Here's Cape Girardeau. So we're really going to focus on this particular area. So let's look at the next slide and see. Missouri has the most mileage across any of the states. And Princess Otaki, she was actually on the James Brown detachment. And I just thought this was interesting. There were 745 people who were, according to the U.S. military, when they left. There were 717 when they arrived. There were 34 deaths just on that one. And they took 177 days. And I told you before that they had planned for 80 days. They were supposed to leave earlier in like August, but there was a bad drought that year. So they waited, and then they didn't leave until October. So now they're going to go through the coldest months of the year, the worst, possible time period. Okay, so by the time they get to the Mississippi River, there's thousands of Indians lined up, and they get to the Mississippi and they can't get across because it is frozen. When we used to have winter, sometimes that happened. So they have to, now of course, part of the budget is they have to pay for provisions, so they've got people riding along and they'll go buy food or whatever and bring it back. They also have to pay farriers to take them across the river, but they can't get across. This is a horse ferry. This is the kind of ferry that they use. The horses were like on a treadmill, and they would just walk, and then that would sort of power this paddle wheel. And so there were a variety of people operating ferries around Cape Girardeau. And so don't worry about all this. One of the stories about Princess Otaki is that on the ferry ride across the river, her ferry either got hit like a big ice chunk, and somehow she falls into the freezing cold water, and then they pull her out, and then when they get across to the state of Missouri, she dies there a few days later. But it took them weeks and weeks. You can imagine trying to get that many people on a small ferry boat from one side of the river to the other. And then this big passage right here is interesting because one of the guys who kept a journal said that there was a huge sandbar that was visible in the middle. So it really was like so they'd ferry him to that sandbar, and then another ferry would take him from the sandbar over to the other side. And so And then that bottom picture is like a more detailed image of what the fairies look like. I thought that was kind of cool. So while I was kind of researching this, Princess Otaki, right, this is, by the way, I don't know how well you can see that. This is Trail of Tears State Park. This is the scenic overlook. And here's this McLean's Chapel. And so while I was kind of researching this area, I was kind of trying to find if there were any people who lived around there and what they thought of and what their impression was of all these Cherokee walking through. And I found this guy, McLean, and there's his chapel right there, McLean's Chapel and Cemetery, and it's on a place called Indian Creek. And this McLean guy turns out to have a really interesting backstory. He was a Revolutionary War soldier, and then many of the Revolutionary War soldiers were paid with land in the West. So he gets this little piece of land, which later he's going to border right up against the Trail of Tears State Park. He didn't get his pension until he was 77, and it was $33.33 a year for fighting in the Revolutionary War. His brother was killed, his brother John was killed, and the family received a half a bushel of salt. So maybe that's where that phrase, you're not worth the salt, comes. I don't know, I doubt it. But according to a letter that I dug up from 1932, David McLean, who was one of Alexander's sons, which is the original guy that had the land grant, was told by Shawnee Indians. There was a large population of Shawnee Indians on Apple Creek, right around here. The Spanish actually gave the Shawnee a land grant because they wanted to have some pressure, perhaps against the Osage. So this is a family story. It was recorded in a letter. I don't think it's like really authentic history. It could be. But David was told by a Shawnee Indian that you can have as much land as you can walk to in 2 days, but you have to be back here. And then that'll be your plot of land. And then he also, according to this family legend, also received a 15-year-old Indian maiden for his wife. And that might be a perfect example of how, if that story's true, then all those children that are descendant, they would have Cherokee ancestry. But maybe they, because she was living in Missouri, she didn't go with the rest of the group to Oklahoma or go back to the original homeland. But that kind of thing possibly could happen. I don't know if it accounts for this huge spike in Cherokee identification, but that could be part of the story. What I thought was really interesting was there's a family story that said, and this would have been like maybe, if this guy was there, in 1831, so this would have been in 1838, so 7 years later, there were supposedly 2 Cherokee men that escaped from the trail, and they hung out on this McLean's property. One of the guys died right away. The other guy built himself like a little shack, and he lived there, and he actually helped these McLean people on their farm, and I guess he just lived out the rest of his life there. Well, when he died, whoever the father or the mother were, they told the children that they were not allowed to plow in these 2 specific locations on their land because that's where these guys were buried. And I thought that is really interesting. That's a really interesting story. I don't know how much of it is true, but the fact that they were told not to plow out of respect for the dead, that really kind of caught my attention. And we're going to link that to the concept of the Trail of Tears State Park. So let's take a look at the next slide. So this Princess Otaki, I'm going to give you the full background on her in a few moments here. But she apparently died in an area near what's called Moccasin Springs, which is just outside of Cape Girardeau. So my grandparents were from Cape, they're dead now, but they lived in Cape Girardeau. So I remember this, and I thought it was so cool, and I thought Moccasin Springs, maybe that's like no, it's for water moccasins. There were so many water moccasins in this spring that they gave it that name. So she dies there, and then apparently, almost immediately, people put up a wooden cross, and they commemorate it. And then the Girl Scouts come along, and they put up an iron cross, a rock, and a plaque to Princess Otaki. So now we're taking this is not Cherokee, this is not a Cherokee place, but this is the descendants of settler colonialists sort of seizing upon a story, sort of making themselves part of the story for many different possible reasons. So when the state park was established in the 60s, early 60s, by the way, it's the only state park where the people of Cape County paid a bond. They said, here, we're going to make a park, and then they gave it to the state. So they really wanted this. And some of the rationale might have been that, okay, they saw all these people in the South going to like, hey, let's go to the Great Smoky Mountains. Let's go to these other Cherokee sort of identified places. And some people argue, Andrew Denson, who his book is called Monuments to Absence, his argument is that the people in Cape Girardeau wanted to create a tourist attraction. And so what better way than to have a state park, right? You can have campers, you can recreate, and sort of in the centerpiece, you have this gravesite. So the Rotary Club spent the money and they built this little grave and they put this pergola over it, and then they have a whole story on the bronze tablet that lays on top of it. And the story is essentially, this is where Princess Otaki died. She was the daughter of Reverend Jesse Bushyhead, and she was known as a strong Cherokee woman. She was helping the other people to make their way through the cold, harsh winter, and we should remember and we should honor this person. Well, there's no such person. Princess Otaki was really a woman named Nancy. This is sort of a letdown. Her name was Nancy Bushyhead Walker Hildebrand. Her father, her paternal ancestors came from Scotland, and apparently he had really bushy red hair, and that's where the Bushyhead kind of came from. She, in 1830, she married a man named John Walker, who was prominent in the Cherokee Nation East. And there was a lot of strife because I kind of alluded to this. There were some people who said, let's stay. There were some people who said, let's go. There were some people who said, let's sign treaties. There were some people who said, no more treaties. And so things got heated. John Walker, her first husband, was killed as a result of this kind of infighting. So then she marries Louis Hildebrand around 1836, and she's on the James Brown detachment. Louis Hildebrand, her husband, was an assistant conductor, so she was from a fairly prominent family. And so she died after crossing the river, and then the local people took care of her grave. The first was this wooden cross. I found that there was a big fire in that area in 1875, and it burned down. I also found out in the early 1900s that somebody had dug the grave up because they thought, this is a princess, and what do princesses have? They've got gold and jewelry, and maybe they have fancy, items that I could get, and I could sell them or pawn them, whatever the case might be. So in 61, the Rotary Club erroneously calls her Princess Otaki, the daughter of Reverend Bushyhead, who led a detachment and crossed the river in 1838 or late 1839. So the Rotary Club and the bronze, not the story, not the right kind of person. And we know that about 4,000 people died on the journey from the east to Oklahoma. So there's thousands of these graves that no one has or has really maintained or even been able to identify. So this kind of became the centerpiece of this state park. Again, what I'm really interested in is the next slide, how this story really kind of takes root. So this is a photograph from the day in 1961 that the park was dedicated. and Rush Limbaugh, remember him? His grandfather came out and gave a speech. Some of the descendants from the Bushyhead family were there. And I found an article in the Post-Dispatch from 1970. There were two of the Bushyheads that lived in the same area out in St. Louis County that I live in. And they talked about, in the article, they reported, there were representatives from the family that came to the ceremony, and they knew that the story that they were telling was inaccurate. But they said it was such a big deal and everybody was dressed up and happy that they didn't want to spoil a good time by trying to correct them, and so they just kind of let it go. And I found this from the Sikeston Daily Standard, a newspaper from 1966, and I just had to quote it because I think it kind of encapsulates maybe the psychology behind the idea of a state park. So the sordid scene of long, long ago, right? You know it's serious when you're using that kind of repetition, long, long ago, like it was so long ago, is erased in the beautiful and breathtaking vistas of the limestone bluffs overlooking the mighty Mississippi River. And so that was just a line from an article about how important the state park was. So this writer seems to suggest that creating a state park is sort of like, it's sort of like a forgiveness for the sordid events of long, long ago. So Princess Otaki became a thing, and I recall as a child, the Otakians, that was the mascot for all of the women's teams at SEMO. And they wore Princess Otaki jerseys. I could not find a picture. This is from a homecoming parade. That's Chief Sagamore, and then he would be accompanied by Princess Otaki, and I couldn't find any pictures of her, so I had to put that one up. But a local newspaper columnist and writer wrote a short novel based on the story, The Trail of Tears and the Trail of Tears Princess. The Girl Scouts adopted the moniker Otaki as the name for their council. There's an Otaki Lake just outside of Sam A. Baker State Park. And this was, you see how the handrail is sort of like lined right up? It says smoke your peace pipe. So that's one of the dorms at SEMO. And so it became embedded into this settler colonial culture. What does it say about the past? Not that much. I think it says more about the rememberers, the people, us, right? The inheritors of this world. And what do we do with the history? What do we do with the iconography? By the way, I found this to be very odd. The Princess Otaki outfit that she wore is housed in the San Diego State University archives. And I read a description of it, and it was modeled after the Comanche style, and there's like hand-engraved silver, pieces of armor or belt buckles or something like that. So I didn't bother to try to find out why it's in San Diego, but that seems like maybe I'll do that presentation next time. So, right? This becomes sort of embedded. I'm just going to kind of skip down here. This is from the Jackson, Missouri Cash Book, and this was an article from 1875. And I've already said this, but this sacred spot was reverenced by everyone. There was the fire, and then someone tried to dig it up because they thought something was wealthy in there. She was buried on a beautiful knoll near the road 1 mile west of the landing by her husband, Hildebrand. So I've read many different newspaper accounts of this, and they don't even seem to really agree on where she was buried. Some say it was on a knoll, which I'm thinking that's like on a hill overlooking something. Some of them say she died in a valley. I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if anybody's actually buried in that tomb. I'm not exactly sure. So, as the Cherokee kind of actively wanted to lobby to have some of these grave sites changed. So in 2001, October, they put up some new signage to try to clarify the story. And then instead of saying that this is where Princess Otaki died, they just said this is in honor of one who endured the removal from 1839 to 1838 to try to correct the record. Okay, and so SEMO changes its mascot in 2005, and people weren't happy about it. This letter just basically says, you're caving. Well, the name Indian was probably adopted to reflect the heritage of the area and to bring recognition for the bravery and courage of Native Americans who occupied the land. It's too bad we've allowed this, some to turn this into a political issue, but increasingly majority rule no longer prevails in this nation, and Indians and Braves and many others will no longer, they'll be history. Are we better? I doubt it. So that was just one letter of people saying, we shouldn't change it. We should keep it, the way as is. So they became the Red Hawk. They became the Red Hawks, and many other schools changed their mascot as well. So then they had a dedication. Several representatives from the Cherokee Nation came, and they tried to, correct the story. So I guess what I'm really kind of interested in is, several things. I still don't know if I have a great answer for why so many people claim to be Cherokee. The idea of a Cherokee princess seems to have touched a nerve and become kind of a trope that we recycle and that we enjoy. What does that say about us? It seems to me like we're kind of, when you take that kind of stance, it's rather dehumanizing, and it seems to maybe reveal a lack of a historical understanding of kind of the events. And I just wanted to sort of leave you with a couple of final thoughts, and that is, I thought it was fascinating that there was a family story that said, we're not going to plow these small patches of ground because someone died and was buried there. But yet, we have a state park where you're encouraged to picnic, to go swimming, to go recreate. And I thought, that's strange. Would we go to Auschwitz, and I asked this in the class, and then have a picnic or go camping? And so it seems like there's a huge disconnect that we don't even connect those two things, hey, let's go out to this place where these people were massacred and let's have a party, right? Like that, those two things don't necessarily go together. But the McLean descendants, at least according to their family stories, which reveals something, they refuse to do that. So I'm just wondering, how do we remember the place and both remember it and recreate it, and what's kind of the appropriate response? And then the last thing I'll leave you with is maybe we could learn something from the Germans. And this is a photograph of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. And if you've ever been there, has anybody ever been there? I got to go. You can go with the college this spring. I don't know if they're going back to Berlin. This is very unsettling. It's all these different shapes, blocks, and you can't really tell from the picture, but the ground sort of undulates. And so when you get in the middle of this, it's almost like a maze. You can't really see what's around that bend. You're kind of in the shadow, but you're also kind of in the light. It's like I said, it's very unsettling. It's very strange. It feels weird is the best way. And then these are the stumbling stones. And so they're just bronze plaques, and they're just a little bit higher than the surrounding cobblestones, and they have the names of Jewish people who lived in the houses, and they're right outside the door. It has the name, it has the date of when they died and where they were sent. Or if they don't know where they were sent, that's parts left off. So the Cherokee princess myth, you can think about that in terms of your own life. And if you have stories like that, maybe you could investigate where they came from. And what I would just like you to kind of think about is, what's the relationship that we have to the past? how do we use space and land to commemorate it, remember it, or to honor what happened there. And that's my talk. So thank you for being here. And if anybody has a question, I'd be glad to entertain it. Yeah.
Excuse me, I've been doing I do genealogy research for a hobby, and I've been, I was using a site called Family Search that's run by Latter-day Saints. And I was poking around and I found one of my ancestors by the name of Major John Downing, who was a British colonel in South Carolina during the Revolution. And it had two different names on there of two different women that said were from the Cherokee tribe, but then he was later executed by them in the 1790s. And I was wondering if you could help me figure that out.
Yeah, I'd be glad. Maybe we could meet afterwards. That sounds like an interesting thing. I'm sure there's some librarians here that could give you some good tips as well. But I'm glad that you're interested in your genealogy. Anybody else?
I have a question about your census data as a government information librarian.
Okay.
I know at some point the census started asking people to self-identify ethnicity, and so I was curious about your chart.
Yes.
And whether or not that big spike corresponded with when they actually started asking people, because before that you could not
You're exactly right.
know that.
As soon as they gave people the option to self-identify, it went off the roof. Yeah.
So it wasn't even an option during that flat part of the graph.
No.
But then each year subsequent to them offering that.
It's gotten higher and higher each year. Yes, up to the point where, so if the self-reporting census data is accurate, there's, like 2 million Cherokee people when there's really something like, 500,000 that are actually enrolled. And if you want to be, by the way, in all this stuff that you read, the people who work like at the Cherokee Office of Enrollment, it's like a running joke. They can't count the number of times someone comes in and says, my great-grandma was a Cherokee princess, can you help me track down? And so one of the article that I read from the Phoenix, the guys who were at that desk said they have a response back and they say, yeah, we know, we still talk about your great-great-grandma because she was so loose morally that we had to ask her to leave the premises. She was a kind of a lascivious type of person.
And had many children.
And had many, many children, yeah. So, thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate the chance to share this with you, and I hope that you found something interesting.